Star Wars 7x7 episode 2445. It's a Spinner Sunday here, and we're going to talk about a story that fills in some of the blanks during that 3-year period that passes or jumps, as it were, in Solo: A Star Wars Story. Punch it. Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod, and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy. And thank you so much for joining me for it. So, last Spinner Sunday, we were talking about the TIE Fighter Limited series that was a bit of a lead-in, as it were, to Alphabet Squadron, and that was loosely associated, although we only got to see glimpses of two of the main characters, Yrica, Quell, and Soren Keyes. It was mostly about other things related to Shadow Wing. But, be that as it may, there was an element there in that story where one of the characters that eventually became part of Shadow Wing apparently appeared in the Han Solo Training Academy story. And so I thought, well, let's just, connect the dot and go back to that. So today we're talking about the limited series that details Han Solo's time in the Yrica Academy. That's the Naval Flying Academy. And the story actually starts with a bit of a prologue to Solo: A Star Wars Story, where we see Han and Qi'ra trying to pull a job for Lady Proxima, and he thinks they've stolen enough food portions to make her happy, but that is utterly not the case, and Han and Qi'ra get zapped with shock prods and dropped in a pit for a week. And they are both talking to each other about, let's get out of here. We don't have anything. We don't have anything to lose. And it goes through a whole, telling of the opening sequence of Solo: A Star Wars Story, where they try to get off Corellia together and are separated, and then he, gets into the academy, or at least he gets to join the Empire and to enlist, and it takes off from there and shows his early days at Yrica Academy. Now, the one thing that we don't know at this point is whether this tells the whole story of Han while he's at the Academy. As we know from Solo: A Star Wars Story, he's eventually kicked out of the Academy and becomes a mud trooper on Mimban, and there is a bit of a wink and a nod to the insubordination that he demonstrates in this series, and if he doesn't cut it out, he's going to end up in some terrible place like Mimban, for example, which, of course, is a bit of foreshadowing, except it's not, because that already happened in, our world, but it's still good fun nonetheless. And the story itself, the whole 5-issue thing, it doesn't necessarily tell one story overall, but it does kind of build to the story that happens in issues 4 and 5, which is an Imperial attack on a planet where, there's a mining colony, and there are 2 native species, and one species has enslaved the other to do mining, and it seems like the Empire is just going to bomb the heck out of them, and possibly all the mining resources are, depleted now, and so they're just wiping everything out, but it's a little hard to tell. Prior to that, though, there's a training exercise that turns out to be, very similar to the kind of mission that the cadet pilots are sent on for their first sort of live fire, live combat situation. And that particular situation happens in issue 2, and there is, a bit of tremendous daring do that Han demonstrates, where one of his, co-pilots, or not co-pilots, I should say, one of the pilots in his squadron is having engine problems, and Han sets his TIE pilot on an automated landing sequence and then ejects to, fly up in the air to land on his fellow pilot's TIE fighter, grab onto it, climbs into the cockpit, and is able to help bring it down for a forced emergency landing. So, fabulous sequence there. And the punishment that everybody goes through as a result of being grounded for the fact that he didn't follow orders in the midst of the mission, and everybody's supposed to be in a meat grinder, and so you're not trying to save each other and all that. Well, it ends up building into one of the great scoundrel stories that we see in Han Solo storytelling. He and his fellow cadets, aside from the ace pilot in the squadron, who we'll get to in a minute or two, they have to go go on a freight hauling mission, flying a cargo freighter to deliver some TIE pilots to a Star Destroyer. But it turns out they're running a day ahead of schedule, and so Han says, oh, look, there happens to be a luxury gambling cruiser nearby. Why don't we stop there? And guess what I found down in the barracks of this cargo hauler? A bunch of day passes. Isn't that great? So they get onto the Pantolomin cruiser, and one of his fellow cadets, Kanina, reveals that she knows that he's been trying to pull something, because the reason why the ship is running ahead of schedule is because when he was pulling extra duty as a result of being punished for his actions in that training exercise, he managed to steal a regulator that he installed on their cargo ship to get the engines running faster. He stole civilian clothing from the laundry, and he stole day passes, or she presumes that he stole day passes from some random officers while they were in the shower or something like that. And it turns out that it's all a setup, because Han believes that he's probably going to run into someone who has contacts back on Corellia, and he can ask them about Kira, which it turns out he is right. There is an Ithorian named Pajolin, pronunciation, who knows, who was checking out this cruiser from time to time, and Han had heard him talking about it, and so he asked him about Kira, and the Ithorian says don't live in the past, and Han says okay, so I guess that means she's alive, and the Ithorian says yeah, and so are you, and pulls out a blaster and says that Proxima hasn't forgotten about him, and there's a 200 credit bounty on his head, which of course incenses Han, because he's like, 200? That's it? Are you kidding me? And it turns out dead or alive. But thankfully his fellow cadets intervene and help him to escape, and it turns out that the Black Sun crime syndicate apparently has something to do with this luxury gambling cruiser, and the security droids or something had been tipped off by Han prior to him finding this Pajolin character. So apparently he thought there was a possibility that Pajolin would double cross him, and he got Pajolin to say something in earshot of the bartender about skimming off the top of shipments that he's doing for Black Sun. So the security droids intervene and help Han escape and tell him, hey, you did us a favor, so you can have another night free in the cruiser on us the next time you're here. Isn't that great? And despite all of the things that Han does that are just so insubordinate, they are trying to figure out how to work with him and how to keep him straight and narrow, because he is showing skills that mean that he may be the best pilot that has ever come through Yrica Academy. And it turns out that his main flight training officer is somebody who, when he was going through Academy, he says he spent more time in the brig than he did in a cockpit, and that he was insubordinate and awful, and the only way he rose to where he was because he finally started following orders, that he came from a chaotic world, but that once he started following orders, he realized the Empire was the end of chaos, and it allowed him to finally be successful. As we know, it's not going to work out that way for Han, but yeah, they're certainly giving him, as much leeway as they possibly can, though they do keep throwing him in the brig because of the things that he does, including the last thing in the series, which also becomes a bit of an origin story for another character. So it turns out that the top pilot within this group of cadets, and they don't actually reveal his name until the third issue, is a character named Baylor Valence. And Baylor Valence eventually goes on to have his own mini-series and now his ongoing series, the Bounty Hunters series. Apparently that character is a character that appeared in Legends previously, and it was not one that I was aware of, so we may look into that at a future date. But he is, the absolute, antithesis of Han, and really hates Han, just like, yeah, they are like oil and water, basically. But Baylor is shot down in this mission that happens in issue 4, and Han is told not to go back for him because that's the way the Empire does things. They'll be overrun soon enough, and then bombers are coming anyway. So Han, being the person that he is, convinces the rest of his squadron to go out on speeder bikes to try and rescue Baylor before the bombing run happens, so that way they can, help him out. And it turns out Baylor has survived the crash, but he is going to lose his leg and he's lost an eye. And when they do successfully get him back to base, we find out that the Empire is not going to pay for him to get a replacement eye or a replacement mechanical leg, that he's going to have to pay for it himself, and that he's going to be grounded permanently, so he's no longer going to be a pilot. And I have not read any of the subsequent stories about this character, but I have a feeling we'll probably be exploring that at some point in the near future. But this seems like a situation where, you know, this would certainly show us how he would become disillusioned with the Empire and decide to lead it and, you know, go out to make his own living. But the, you know, whole thing of, you know, what, they weren't coming to rescue me, like this was an unauthorized thing, like he was kind of shocked that to find out that Han and the rest of the squadron were coming for him when they were told not to. And Han's like, you know, what part of that whole, like, you're just meat for the meat grinder stuff never sank in for you? Overarching all of this, though, it's made clear that even during Han's time in all of this Academy stuff, he just wants to get back to Corellia to rescue Kira. He tries pretty immediately in the first issue to steal a TIE fighter and get away. And during this mission that's happening in issues 4 and 5, he admits that he was thinking about trying to, you know, get away from this mission, but ultimately he was helping his comrades because, you know, that's just the bonds that you build up when you're spending time with each other, I guess. And it's sort of the same thing, you know, there's a parallel, if you will, with Yrica Quell in the Alphabet Squadron novels, where, you know, her whole thing was that she was initially learning to, you know, fly a TIE fighter in order to, you know, then defect and join the rebellion. But over time, she just, you know, got more and more involved and invested in the lives of the people that she was working with, and she just kind of stayed. It just kind of happened to her. And something like that happens with Han here in this, in that he, you know, stayed to help Baylor and make sure that the rest of his squadron would get back safely, but, you know, instead of just leaving and leaving everybody to their fate. And the story ends with Han in the brig again because of the unauthorized rescue mission. That's certainly also a difference between Han and Yrica, in that I don't get the impression that Yrica Quell spent a lot of time in the Imperial brig, but anyway, that's basically the gist of Han in the Yrica Academy story, the limited series from Marvel about that. And again, we don't necessarily know when it is that he's ultimately kicked out of the Academy. It doesn't seem like he's kicked out at this point, but there's got to be something that happens that just completely blows it off the rails, and it's not in this particular story. But anyway, that right there is going to do it for this episode of the show, and it just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for it, as always. And may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.
Star Wars 7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright 2021 by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.